Hi, my name is Davide Raffaele Ceratti and I am presenting to you today the talk with the title Eppur si muove, Proton Diffusion in Allied Perovskite Single Crystals. This work was made in a group of Professor David Cahen at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. Currently, I'm working with Dr. Jean-François Guillemot at the Institut Photovoltaique d'Île-de-France in Paris. The Italian in the text, Eppur si muove, is the original of the words and yet it moves, that were famously pronounced by Galileo Galilei. When this happened, he was obliged to disown his claim that the Earth moves around the Sun. We use the phrase for marketing, but it is true that we often face the refusal of the idea of proton migration in a light perovskite more based on assumptions than on evidence. In this talk we show that protons do diffuse. We also show that the proton diffusion is at the origin of the large scatter of the values of the ion diffusion coefficient using the Occam razor. Let's start. I found the first hint suggesting the effects of proton migration while investigating the effect of photobleaching inside cesium, formamidinium and methylammonium lead bromide single crystals through to photon microscopy. While the first two experience damage from the photobleaching, the methylammonium shows to increase its photoluminescence, a phenomenon called light soaking. The logical conclusion is that a reversible reaction involving methylammonium is at the origin of this effect. The only available one is the deprotonation of methylammonium to methylamine, which involves having mobile protons in the perovskite. The consensus is that protons should have a very low density in the order of 10 to the 11 per cubic centimeter. The value is explicit in an article which is cited by the 90% of the papers discussing ion migration in perovskites. The value is obtained by a reasonable back-of-the-envelope calculation based on the acidity constant of methylammonium in water. Regrettably, the community considered the subject surveyed with this, even if no experimental evidence was brought about the proton density in the perovskites. The reasoning leading to the exclusion of protons as the relevant ions migrating inside a light perovskite could be valid. However, it cannot be taken for granted that the value of the constant of acidity inside the perovskite is the same as in water. The second major hint suggesting proton migration is derived by the analysis of the diffusion coefficient of the ions inside the perovskite. Let's consider to begin some references for our discussion, such as the rapidly diffusing ions in solution or protons in Nafion. On the other side, we have the bromide ions in PbBr2, which are slower but still more rapid than most ions in other solids. We can separate the methods to quantify the diffusion coefficient of ions in the perovskite into three categories. The first one is related to alternated current methods, such as impedance or capacitance spectroscopy. In this, an alternating electric field is applied and the current compensating the movement of ions recorded. Below a certain frequency, ions can travel all across the perovskite layer, and the typical time scale they need is simply related to the diffusion coefficient and its thickness by this mathematical relation. Alternatively, a more accurate analysis is performed by fitting the data at low frequency of the Nyquist plot using the Warburg impedance. The problem is that ions moving in the shown way give exactly the same signal of cations, such as protons, moving in this other way. The second group of methods are based on applying a constant bias to the perovskite samples and monitoring some observables over time. For example, in this video we see how part of the sample is decreasing its photoluminescence next to the positive electrode. These phenomena are usually considered the effect of the accumulation of the anions near the positive electrode. However, there is no reason to exclude that they are actually due to the depletion of protons migrating to the negative one. The last one, instead, detects the movement of the anions directly. Techniques like energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy or glow discharge emission spectroscopy or photoluminescence are used to evaluate the rate of exchange of the anions between the perovskite and an anion source. Here we see an example. Contacting a bromine-based perovskite with a chloride one, there will be an exchange of anions that can be followed by photoluminescence and used to deduce the diffusion coefficient. As we can see, most of the values from the electrical methods which do not identify the moving ions are large, while the diffusion coefficients of the directly identified anions are small. Using the Occam's razor, it is reasonable to think that the fastest values belong to the fast mobile protons, similarly to other materials, while the slowest value belong to the anions, also more in line with the other solid. But let's bring some experimental evidence. I exposed some allied perovskite single crystals to deuterated water. To do this, I placed the single crystals in small vials that were placed in larger vials containing saturated solutions of potassium carbonate in deuterated water. This allowed having a relative humidity of 45% that doesn't degrade the perovskite crystals. With the time, the deuters penetrate into the perovskite crystals, substituting the protons in the methylammonium or formamidinium groups. The progression of the exchange can be tracked by defining the value m, which is the ratio between the density of deutons and the total density of deutons plus protons in the material. Values of m in function of time can be obtained by liquid NMR quantification of the dissolved crystals. In this graph, each data point corresponds to a crystal and an experiment. Fitting this data with a diffusion model provides the values of the diffusion coefficient. These crystals can also be analyzed by Raman spectroscopy, since the signatures of protonated and deuterated methylammonium are fully recognizable. It is therefore possible to plot the values of m in function of the depth in the crystal. The fitting with a Fick-like diffusion model provides values of the diffusion coefficient which are very similar to the ones obtained with the previous method. Here we report the values of the diffusion coefficient of protons in the relevant perovskite in an Arrhenius plot. Data have been collected between 108 degrees and -19. It is possible to fit this data to obtain the activation energy of proton migration, which, as we can see, is about half electron volt. As a consequence, visible light should be able to stimulate proton migration. I proceeded then to perform other tests. In the first one, I substituted the deuterated water with other solvents, which can also exchange deutons, like deuterated acetic acid, deuterated trifluoroacetic acid, and deuterated phosphoric acid. However, I did not identify any exchange of deutons into the crystal. On the other hand, I could detect a slow but still present diffusion when using deuterated ethanol. Since ethanol is never completely dry, I cannot exclude there are traces of water that allow diffusion. But how do protons migrate? Which is the chemical mechanism? If you have a perfect crystal, there cannot be any migration. On the other hand, if a proton is missing from its place, nearby protons can replace it, leaving behind a vacancy that can be filled again by other protons, and so on. This corresponds to the reaction here written, where the proton from the methylammonium in red migrates to the methylamine in blue. However, we can consider to have also something else, for example water, which can accept protons or also act as a bridge. The reaction corresponding to this mechanism between water and methylammonium is here reported. Water can enter the perovskite structure as shown in this geometry, when it forms an hydrogen bond with methylammonium. If water captures a proton, the remaining methylamine can form another bond. Possibly, it binds to the lead, forming a stable pseudomolecular species. If the bond forms, the reaction is then pushed to the right. In collaboration with Lior Kronik and Ayala Cohen, we found by theoretical calculation that methylamine can effectively bind to the lead, partially confirming our hypothesis. Involvement of water and the bond between methylamine and lead greatly modifies the expected value of the constant of the acidity of methylammonium in the perovskite. This value is directly linked to the variation of Gibbs free energy of the corresponding reaction. From the calculation, even considering positive values of the delta G, we can obtain proton densities orders of magnitude higher than the one previously considered. We can plot the amount of protons able to migrate as a function of water concentration in the perovskite for different values of delta G. By weighting the perovskite before and after drying, I estimated the amount of water to be 1 molecule per 20 unit cells. Intersection between the red line and the other lines provides the estimated amount of migrating protons once the value of delta G is known. Further details about this image are provided in the publication. A variation of the relative humidity can modify the total amount of water in the structure. This will move the line to the left and reduce the amount of available protons to migrate, and, consequently, the proton diffusion coefficient in the perovskite. Coming back to our analysis of the ion diffusion coefficient in the literature, we can understand that differences in humidity can modify the obtained values. The publication which do not control the humidity during the measurement showed faster migration than the ones where the samples could be considered dry. These last were probably showing the migration of anions. For further confirmation, we performed impedance spectroscopy on methylammonium lead bromide and proton-free cesium lead bromide, exposed to 45% relative humidity. As we can see, both samples showed a transition at low frequency corresponding to the migration of the bromide. However, only methylammonium lead bromide showed a transition at higher frequency corresponding to the protons. But what we can conclude from this talk? We have three main points. First, we have direct proof of proton migration in a light perovskite. Second, we prove that water is fundamental for the migration of protons in the perovskite, and that its concentration strongly influences the value of the diffusion coefficient. Third, we found the origin of the inconsistencies of the value of diffusion coefficient of ions in the perovskite. This is due to the fact that the ions that diffuse fast are actually protons and not the anions like iodide or bromide, which diffuse slowly. The subjects of proton migration and proton chemistry in the perovskite surely require further investigation. These, indeed, have consequences on both the electric properties and the stability of the material. For example, it would be useful to determine by DFT the energy and the exact pathway of the reaction involving the protonation of water. Also, it is of extreme importance to determine the relation between humidity and the water content in the perovskite, something that remains elusive. To do this are needed a very good control of the humidity and sensitive techniques to detect water molecules in the ppm range. These would also allow assessing the reversibility and the energy of the hydratation of the perovskite, which are still not known. I actually have some other thoughts that I would appreciate to share in personal meeting or by email. For example, which could be the effect of changing the electron richness of the perovskite on proton migration? We know indeed that this influences the lead anion cage electron density, which means that the lead-nitrogen bond strength may also be modified. Further considerations are about the acid-base chemistry of water and methylamine, which are likely to create new, still unexplored effects. For example, once water is protonated, methylamine can escape, leaving the hydronium ion at the place of methylammonium. Also, we can imagine the water to capture protons from external acidic sources, with consequent capture of the counter ions for charge balance. Further discussion can be made about the protons migrating in the other layers of the solar cells, and so on. So, to really conclude, please feel free to contact me. I'm really looking for discussion, collaboration, and to share my idea about this subject, because I really think we are missing something. And that's all, folks. Thank you for listening.